Hey everyone, Taylor here from Cosmic, and today we're talking about compression. Now, I want to keep today's video very practical, so we're going to be talking about 3 ways that we can use compression in our tracks. The first way is to shape an individual sound. The second way is on a group or a bus to glue things together and make the instruments in the group more cohesive together. And the third way is to balance and control what I'll call sustained but dynamic material. So stuff that plays over a longer period of time in your track that we still need to control the dynamics of. So you can think about bass lines, FX, pads, sub basses are a big one. And then in this video, we're gonna be talking about vocals. So I'm gonna give you an example of that. And we'll walk through each of these 3 methods together. Now, before I jump into Ableton, I just want to say, if you guys have been finding these videos helpful, of course, subscribe to Cosmic Academy, like this video, and there's a lot more stuff like this coming soon. We're always aiming for the practical tips. Now, let's jump into the project and walk through these methods together. All right, guys, so as I mentioned, we're going to go through 3 different ways that we can use compression in our productions. And you'll notice I've got a pretty simple Ableton project up right now. It's a kick drum, it's a drum group, and a vocal channel. Ignore the vocal channel for now. We're going to focus on that later. Let's focus on the first 2 methods of compression, which is to shape an individual sound, and on a group to bring the group more cohesive, to glue the sounds in the group together. And we're going to use this drum group as a way to demonstrate those methods. So I've got a compressor here on the snare, and I've got a compressor here on the drum group, and I've got a keyboard macro set up. So when I press a key here on my keyboard, it turns off both compressors. So let me play through this looped section of these drums. And when I press that key, it's going to turn both compressors off. Listen to the difference with the compressors on versus the compressors off. We'll start with them on. Cool, so what you'll hear there is when the compressors are on, everything gets a bit more cohesive, feels more polished, feels more balanced. The volumes feel all relatively similar. The snare gets quieter, but it gets appropriately quieter compared to the volumes of the rest of the drum elements. When I turn the compressor off, that snare immediately awkwardly pokes out of the mix, and the ride, the hi-hats, the shaker, they kind of collapse back in the mix. It sounds very unbalanced. It doesn't sound cohesive. It really sounds more like a group of audio samples playing in a pattern, not like a polished, cohesive drum group that feels like it belongs together. So let's jump into how we can use compression to get that result. And let's start with the first method, which is how to shape an individual sound using a compressor. Let's start with this snare. All right, so I pulled up a compressor on this snare channel. I've dialed in some settings, and what I was hearing on this snare is that the body part of the snare, the white noise part that comes after the initial transient, was, at least in my opinion, perceived to be a little bit louder than the actual transient itself. And I've got a pretty snappy kick on this drum groove, and I kind of want to match that snap that I have on the kick with a snappy transient on the snare. And I like the sonic quality of this snare, so I want to keep this sample. I just want to shape the dynamics of the sound as it plays. So what we can do in this compressor is I'll turn it off and on, listen very, very carefully to the snap of the transient and the body, the white noise part of the snare, and how it changes when I turn the compressor on and off. So you can kind of hear what I mean. That white noise part of the snare actually feels a little bit louder than the actual initial transient of the snare. So let's walk through the settings that I used to get here. So the first thing I want to say is that I've turned up the gain on the compressor. Look at these meters here. This is really important to understand about compression because so many people, when the sound gets louder, they think it's better. This is the first thing that you want to keep an eye out for when you're compressing something. You want to constantly adjust this gain knob. Look at these volume meters on the right side. The left is before the compression, the right is after. you'll notice they're lined up almost exactly. If I turn this back down to 0, I'm getting so much volume reduction on the compression that my compressed signal is significantly quieter. We want to gain match them so that we're hearing the compression and we're not hearing the difference in volume. We're hearing what the compressor is actually doing to the dynamics. So I've matched those up. So, and typically you want to do that last. I'm just doing that now here to kind of demonstrate that to you guys. But let's pull down this threshold all the way. Let's push the ratio all the way up, because the easiest way to hear compression is to go extreme with the settings and hear what the attack and release are doing. Adjust the attack and release, then back off on the threshold and the ratio to an appropriate level. So what you're hearing there is the 49 milliseconds that the compressor is letting through before it bites down on the sound. And because the ratio is so high and the threshold is so low, when the compressor starts to work after 49 milliseconds, it totally just turns the volume all the way down. So what we're hearing is the initial transient on that snare. So I like that. It's a nice snappy sound. It's the compressor is letting through that initial snap. And now we can shape that white noise body part of the snare using the threshold and the ratio. I like where the attack is. I like where the release is. Let me just start to ease back on the threshold and the ratio, and you'll hear that second half of the snare sound begin to get a little bit louder, and we can shape that part of the snare using this compressor. And what I love about this compressor is you can see visually, the red line is the amount of compression. Look what it does to the actual waveform of the audio. So just like I've described, it's letting through that initial transient, and then it's clamping down on that second part of the sound. So I'm kind of liking how this is sounding now. Again, I'm not really, it's not really that it's increasing the snap of the snare. It's just increasing the way the snare is perceived. It feels like the snap is significantly louder now because the rest of the audio is actually turned down. That it changes the relationship between the first part of the sound and the second part of the sound. So it feels like the snare is a lot more snappy. Let's hear the AB one more time. Yeah, so we're getting a lot more snap out of that. It's really in line with what we're seeing visually. So I'm satisfied with that result. Let's back off on it a little bit more. I like to find what I like and then back down like 10% more just so I don't overdo things. But I'm satisfied with that. Let's turn now to the second method of compression that we can use, which is group processing, to kind of tie things together on a group. All right, so here we are on the drum group. Same basic concept. I brought in a compressor. I've dialed in some settings. Let's start by hearing the AB with the compressor on versus the compressor off. So just like we were hearing before, when the compressor's off, the snare kind of pokes out very loudly. The ride, the hi-hat, and the shaker kind of fall back in the mix. It doesn't sound natural. When I turn the compressor on, the snare gets pushed down a little bit. The hi-hat, the ride, and the shaker get brought up, and it brings everything in the group, all the instruments, a little bit closer together, which gives us a more natural result. It feels more cohesive, and if you think about a real-life drum kit, it wouldn't sound normal for the ride to be very quiet and feel far away, but the snare to be right up front and in your face and loud. That's not a very familiar sound to a listener. So by bringing this stuff closer together, we get a more familiar sound. It feels more cohesive and natural in the context of our song. I do want to note that the first thing you would do in a real project is to adjust these volume differences using the volume sliders, and then reach for a compressor for that last 10 to 15% of cohesion. I'm just relying more on the compressor today to show you guys what it's capable of for purposes of instruction here. So let me turn this on. Let me crank down the threshold. Let's crank up the ratio. Let's turn off the wet gain and do this process together. Watch what the compressor does to the loud spikes of audio here when I have the settings a bit more extreme. So you'll see, just like we discussed, it's pushing down that snare, pushing down the hi-hats. It's pushing everything that's loud basically down to this -18 line. So it's really just pushing those loud parts down. Let me back off on these settings, get a more natural result. Cool, so you see it's still pushing down the hi-hats and that snare, bringing everything closer together. Now it's pushing it down to about that -12 line. And so we're getting all the loud parts pushed down. And for group compression, that's only really half of the story, right? So we don't just want to push everything down to the lowest common denominator. We also want to push everything up a little bit to compensate for the volume reduction that we're getting. And this is really important for group processing especially. And that's what the job of this wet gain or this makeup gain knob is. So let's go through this process together. You'll see on the left side is the input volume knob. That's the volume of the signal going into the compressor. And as I adjust the wet gain knob, the output meter is going to change. And what I'm aiming to do is get the peak levels to be the same. So the peak level is going to be the same. And I'm just bringing up the quiet parts without increasing any of the peak volume. Cool, so you see the peaks are about the same. And so everything that I'm doing here, basically I'm adding 4.5 decibels of volume to this whole group while also pushing down the loud parts. And so I'm getting the same peak volume. And this is why the quiet parts like the ride, the hi-hat, and the shaker, the quiet parts of those that are below the threshold are getting pushed up. And the parts of the audio like the snare that are above the threshold are getting pushed down. And so we're just getting even more squeeze on this audio to bring everything together to make it more cohesive. So now that we've done this adjustment, listen one more time to the AB with the compressor on and off. So again, same effect. Snare gets pushed down, quiet stuff gets pushed louder, and now we have a cohesive, appropriately loud drum bus where everything feels like it's naturally together. All right, so let's discuss that third way that we can use compression in our tracks, and that is to balance and control sustained but dynamic material. So think about effects, pads, bass lines, sub basses are a big one because each note that changes in its volume from note to note a lot of the time, and vocals are the most obvious example of this. They play out for a long period of time, but they're very dynamic, and we need to control the differences in volume among the different points in time as the vocal plays out, or any instrument that plays out over a sustained period of time that has dynamics we need to control. So listen to this vocal without any compression, and you'll hear the quiet parts of this waveform will be very quiet, and you'll see and hear where visually it seems very loud. You'll see the differences in the loudness as you hear his vocal. Show me you believe. So that second word's really loud. You can see as he holds this note, he gets really loud in the middle of it as well. We've got these two words that are really quiet. I do want to say, just like in the group compression, you want to do a little bit of manual work first. So you take a word like this that's really quiet, you come in here and you would adjust this manually so that we're getting something that's closer to the starting line as opposed to relying on the compressor to do everything for us. But again, for purposes of this video today, we're going to just rely on the compressor so I can show you guys what the compressor is capable of. So let's turn this on. I want to show you that I've got the auto gain feature on because I trust the compressor to make the gain adjustments for me. Since we've already discussed what this gain knob does, I felt like I could just leave the auto gain on this time. And watch what the compressor is doing to both the quiet parts and the loud parts. So on those really quiet words, you'll see it actually turns it up a little bit. On the really loud words like me, or when he gets really loud here in that note, you'll see the compressor is actually going to be turning things down. And so just again, like we've discussed, pushing everything closer together. Watch what it does. You believe. Show me you believe. Show me you turns the first word up a little bit, turns the word you up a little bit. And what's really interesting is when he sustains that note, the compressor, you can see this red line actually doing the inverse of what that volume is doing on that note. So it's just really getting a more consistent performance out of the way he holds that note. Watch one more time, just that sustained part of the vocal. Really, really interesting. And, you know, it's kind of reacting exactly how we expect it to react now that we know how compression works, right? So when a loud part comes, the compressor reacts, and as it gets quieter, it kind of backs off automatically because we're not as far into that threshold. And so the result is that when I play this all with this whole line with the compression versus without, it's a lot more natural sounding. It sounds like he's singing everything basically at the same volume. Check it out. Show me you believe. And off. Show me you believe. And on one more time. Show me you believe. All right, guys, so I hope this was helpful. I hope you're seeing how you can use these methods in different practical ways on different types of material in your tracks to get the results you want. And I hope compression's been demystified a little bit today as well. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments. And again, if you're enjoying our videos, like this video, subscribe to Cosmic, and we got more good stuff like this coming soon. Anyway, guys, I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.